today, everyone. It's so exciting to see you all here. I know we're going to have a great call. If you're not familiar with brand Pollinators, we are a consultancy that offers branding and marketing support to emerging purpose-driven brands. And we're also running this community of really awesome impact-driven founders. And so this monthly call is an event where we bring in a guest expert. We also send out a weekly email, and that usually has stuff like awards you can apply for, conferences you can attend, or different marketing tips. So we just do whatever we can to support founders, and we love being able to kind of cheer on your successes and provide whatever resources we can to help you. So yeah, this call today is about retail. I know a lot of our brands are in the retail space or in the consumer packaged goods space. So it's obviously a really important channel to be able to use retail. And we've got our guest expert, Alli Ball, here.
Hi,
so, Alli,
thanks for having me. Hi, Kate.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Alli's the founder and CEO of Food Biz Wiz, and the creator of the Retail Ready program, which is an online course, coaching, and community for producers of packaged goods in the food industry. And so she is a former grocery buyer, and she is now a consultant helping people, emerging brands, to understand how to get their products on shelves and, of course, off shelves, because we need people buying the products from the store. And so she shares a lot of those behind the scenes secrets of that wholesale buyer process. So very excited to have you here today, Alli.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited to. I love that we have such an intimate group, because it means that we can really make sure to address your questions as well. Because Kate, you and I brainstormed some questions that we can talk about, but I want to make sure that this is really valuable for you guys who are attending. So I'll reiterate what Kate said. If you have questions as we go, or if you need us to clarify things, just put them in the chat, unmute yourself. Happy to make this casual and make sure that you guys get the most out of it.
Awesome.
Kate just froze on me. Is she frozen for you guys as well? Okay. I'm like, it might be me, but we'll see. I guess I'll just kick things off since Kate's frozen. What would be really helpful for me is if you guys just put in the chat who you are and what your business is. Just like a one sentence, so I can get a sense of where you guys are coming from and where you're at. Let's see. I don't think Kate made me a co-host. So I'm hoping, I'll just say disclaimer, if she has to shut this down, we might all have to come back to the Zoom room. I see some familiar names in here too. So yeah, Kate left and I'm now the host. Okay, great. Let's kick it off. I know that Kate, let's see, Jeff Lucas, sales director at Women's Bean Project. Pleasure meeting you all. Yeah, I loved hearing a little bit about your mission earlier, Jeff. Kimberly, founder of Bake Me Healthy. Yeah, I'm working on developing a line of healthy baking mixes. Awesome. Okay, great. So I know, I'm going to keep reading here. Read the ingredients is a complete meal alternative, cleanest, baked, nutritionally dense, and balanced, vegan, gluten-free, unsweetened, functional bread. Awesome. Martha, founder of Itacate Foods, a brand of Latin backpacking meals. Oh, so cool, Martha. Awesome. Great. Hi, Kate. You're back with us.
I don't know what happened. I'm so glad you guys are still here. I was like,
yeah. You froze on us, and I turned to the rest of the folks. I was like, is she frozen for you guys too? Because I'm just going to keep on talking.
Okay, no, that's perfect. Okay, so you got to meet some people who are here.
Yeah.
Very cool. Okay, so starting with the basics.
Yeah.
About how retail works. Questions here, but basically, what do brands need to know about categories? Because I think that's one of the things that's important when you're looking at getting into retail, is like what category you're in.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll repeat the question, because Kate, you broke up a little bit on my end too. But so the question is, what do brands need to know about how categories work? So let's start at a high level here. A category, quite simply, is a grouping of like types of brands. So categories might be dairy, confections, baking mixes, canned beans and vegetables, frozen, supplements, all of these things. The challenging thing is that most stores design their own categories. So you might be in the baking mix category in one store, and you might be in the gluten-free category in another store. So there are some similarities, and you'll generally find yourself in a similar category in each store, but there's no like 20 categories that every single store uses every single time. So from a high level, it is a category is your like-minded group of products. And the most important thing to know here is that buyers, wholesale buyers, evaluate your products compared to all other brands in your category. So buyers bring in new products to enhance sales or margin in a particular category. So let's say you make frozen baby food. That buyer wants to know that when they bring in your product line, you are going to bring higher sales or more margin to the frozen category or to that baby food category, right? So that buyer is always taking a risk on bringing in your product. They're taking a bet, they're placing a bet that your brand is going to help them meet their category goals. So it's really important that we think about categories when we design sales pitches or when we start talking to those wholesale buyers, because they want to trust that you are going to come in and support their buyer category goals. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. I see lots of nodding.
Okay, I switched. I got kicked out. I switched to a new location. Okay, so what are some questions that people should consider before deciding on a retailer? Then, if they know the category, then when they're going to go for a retail location, what's something they should consider?
Yeah, I'm glad that you asked this, Kate, because especially with our purposeful brands or impact-driven brands, we want to make sure that you are designing your channel strategy or designing your retail strategy so that you are going where your audience is already looking for your products, similar products in your category. We want to make sure that, especially if you're just dipping your toes into retail, that you are aligning with retail partners who attract the audience that you are seeking for your product line. And Kate, I think this is one of the biggest challenges for new brands is that it's really flattering when a retailer wants to carry you. And it's really flattering if you get that inquiry on your website or like in the DMs, like, oh, you might be a great fit for our store. Like, can you send me samples? Can you give me more information? But not all products are the right fit for all wholesale accounts. And there's nothing more heartbreaking than getting your product on a shelf and then having it just sit there, or having it eventually get discontinued because it's not meeting the category goals. So on a high level, Kate, I always think about making sure that you are doing your research, whether that's like internet sleuthing, looking at their social media accounts, like it's frankly asking the buyer the demographic of their shoppers to make sure that you're actually the right fit for those shelves before you say yes, or before you even put your energy into pitching a new account. Does that make sense, Kate?
Yeah. And would you say that like the location of the stores or the distribution facilities for those stores is important too?
100%. So we see a lot of mistakes that brands make, right? And one of the mistakes that we see is that brands try to expand too far, too fast. I would much rather see brands go deep in their own region where you can actually support your product on the shelf rather than ship your product all over the country thinking that, you know, you'll find a way to make those sales with that aligned store in New York or LA or whatever it is. And then Kate, you're right, there's also the logistics challenge of getting your product outside of your region, right? Making sure that you've got the right, whether you're doing direct, or if you're working with brokers or distributors, that you do have the right logistic partners in place to physically get your product to the store.
Yeah. And I mean, it's from an environmental standpoint, it makes sense too, because you're not having to, ship products as far either. Yeah. So looking at where those distribution facilities are. And speaking of which, I mean, I know a lot of times you're going to be working through a broker. So is that something that, I mean, you have to do, or what are your thoughts on, when you get into a retailer, does that automatically mean you need to use a broker?
Yeah, let's talk about, let's take a step back and just clarify the difference with brokers and distributors and going direct, and like the different options that you can use. So from a high level, you can either do sales internally. You can do it. You can have an internal salesperson, someone on your team who is doing sales for you. You can have a broker who is essentially an external salesperson. There's a couple different pay structures for that, but typically you're going to pay a percentage of sales for that broker to broker the sale of your product. And then there's the distributor who focuses on distributing your product, literally physically getting your product to the store. And again, one of the mistakes that we see brands make is thinking that the distributor is going to sell your product for you, that the distributor is going to get your product on new shelves. They're going to promise you that they're going to do that, and they're going to sell you on that, but they distribute your products. That's it. The brokers broker the deal, or internally you can be your own salesperson. So Kate, I think it's really important to have that understanding before we talk about whether you need brokers or distributors, because there's a lot of confusion about what a broker does and what a distributor does. Oftentimes brands, especially younger brands, you'll keep sales in-house as long as you can. And then potentially you will hire a broker. And typically then that broker works in tandem with your distributor. So often it's not an either or situation for the broker and distributor. Typically people have both, which means a lot of margin going out the door. So unless you are prepared to do that, unless you're financially prepared to do that, you really need to make sure that you're not like jumping again too far, too fast. So you do not need a broker or a distributor to get into retail, period. We have brands inside of Retail Ready who are in 1,000 stores with 0 brokers and 0 distributors. They're doing, almost $750,000 in sales, all direct. Does it mean that it's easy? Like, no, of course not. They really focus on sales and delivery logistics themselves. They have a shelf-stable product that's really lightweight and easy to ship around the country. They've got a great internal marketing team. But no, I think it's really important to remember that there's no one size fits all in grocery, and that just because one brand uses a broker and distributor doesn't mean that you have to as well. As you get into bigger and bigger stores, you will be pushed or suggested that you start using brokers and distributors, but it's not a requirement for all stores.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And so with all of the expense that goes along with getting into retail, I mean, does a brand have to be in retail? I mean, what about just being like an online retailers or consumer website?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kate. So again, I get really riled up when people say that there's a one size fits all strategy, because there's not. It is so important for brands to figure out what you can do, what works for your own business model, right? What works for that ice cream brand likely doesn't work for that canned bean brand, right? Very different categories, very different models. The challenge, there's basically two types of online sales that we can do when we start thinking about e-commerce. You can either do direct to consumer, which has its own set of challenges, or you can do online wholesale accounts. When we think about direct to consumer, we have to realize that the percentage, the conversion rate on your website is typically about 4%. Shopify's typical conversion rate for food and beverage is 4%. So that means that for every 100 people who come to your website, 4 people make a purchase. And so it's really interesting to think about, frankly, like how can you get enough traffic to your website to get enough purchases there? And so, Kate, this is typically, we see the brands that we work with who have a lot of success direct to consumer, either have a big budget for paid ad spend. They have someone on their marketing team who is really savvy with social media and email marketing. And they're layering in other direct to consumer channels, maybe in-person events, farmers markets, pop-ups, really heavy into email marketing, subscription boxes, things like that. So that's, does that make sense with e-commerce? Like if you build it, they will come. I always talk about like, this is the worst business advice that I've ever heard. We've got to have that strategy in place for getting the sales.
Well, I used to do web design for a company, and it was like, just because you build a website doesn't mean people are going to find it or use it or know how to get back to it. So it's a challenge. And I think the products specifically make it difficult too, because like you said, if it's ice cream, then you're talking about shipping expenses probably being through the roof, that you're either going to have to swallow or you're going to have to pass that on to customers, which is going to reduce your conversion rate even more. So
totally. And so then, and it is interesting because of course, like during pandemic, we saw a rise in online sales. Of course, like absolutely. Pre-pandemic, our Shopify conversion rates were 2 to 3%. And now they're hovering around 4%, right? And if we think about it, it makes sense. Like, I'll ask everybody on the call, like, when was the last time you went to another brand's website every single week and ordered your granola direct to consumer, or your milk direct to consumer, or your toilet paper direct to consumer? I think about myself. I am a very conscious shopper, and that's something that actually like doesn't feel aligned with me. I'm not going to buy 1 bag of granola and have it shipped to my door every week, right? So think about like your target audience and if they're actually shopping in that way. So the place where we actually have seen a lot of growth online, Kate, over pandemic was through online wholesale. Like the Thrive Markets of the world, or here in the Bay Area, Good Eggs is a really, really popular one. And that is an online shopping experience where that consumer can build an entire basket and get it delivered to their door, either, Thrive Market, like literally shipping it to your door, or a direct delivery service with that company. And that really mimics the consumer shopping experience, right? Where you're building the whole basket, there's a whole bunch of different brands, and it's one checkout process. The really important thing to remember about platforms like that is that it's still wholesale. So there's still a person, a real person on the other side of that platform, like at Thrive Market, making category decisions. So you have to have that it's actually a very similar sales and pitch strategy for getting on e-commerce wholesale accounts as you would in-person accounts. You still have to prove that your product is going to support that category goals. You still have to have a follow-up, like sales pipeline, and a follow-up sequence for when you never hear back from that buyer. You still have to have all those same systems, whether it is, Whole Foods Market that you're pitching to, or the online markets of the world.
That's such a
and they still take margin, right? They're still going to take like 40%. So it can be a tough go. It can be a really tough go.
So speaking of it being a real person, you were in those shoes on the retail side. Like, what is it like being a buyer when having people constantly like wanting you to carry their product?
It is wonderful and flattering, and you get to feel like this, like, arbiter of taste, right? You could, especially because so I was at Buy Right here in San Francisco for a long, long time. I left Buy Right, started consulting with other retail stores across the country, helping train category managers and buying practices and category reviews and stuff. And it's a weird power position to be in, right? Where you get to choose what goes on the shelf. But at the same time, it's by and large, it's a blue collar job. I was working 10, 11, 12-hour days on like in refrigeration, like wearing a hoodie and freezer gloves and my dance goes and like standing for 8, 9, 10 hours, like on cement floors. Like it is a physically demanding job. It's grocery, right? And buyers are often pulled in many, many different directions. So again, as we get to larger and larger stores, those roles become narrow and narrower in scope. But I think a lot of emerging brands, at least what I see, tend to start with independents or those smaller chains and stuff. And typically a grocery buyer in that type of store manages a staff. They do the category reviews. They might even be running floor shifts. They're managing inventory and counting things and placing orders. They're remerchandising, right? They're doing a lot of different things in their day-to-day. And tasting samples and listening to sales pitches is only a teeny tiny part of their day-to-day. So it's really important to recognize this, because I think so often brands see the buyer as the gatekeeper to your success, right? Okay, yeah, Kimberly's nodding. See that buyer as like, oh, if only I could get that cranky buyer to say yes to my product line. Like if only I could get that cranky buyer to like, get back to me. But typically they have a whole host of other things that they are managing in their day-to-day. So Kate, I have a golden rule that we share in Retail Ready that I'll share here. But my golden rule for brands, especially with independents and smaller stores, is to not swing by.
Oh, you don't like it when people just walk in?
Well, it's funny because we can actually just ask on the call. I typically ask on the call here, like, how many of you have just swung by with your samples for that buyer? And you like leave them, maybe you try to talk to the buyer, or you leave them in like a little brown craft bag with your sell sheet and your business card and your samples, and you leave them with a friendly cashier or something like that. But think about it, right? Like you wouldn't want someone to swing by when you're in the middle of a production shift, or you're in the middle of co-packing run, or whatever it is. That buyer doesn't want to be interrupted during their busy workday either. So I always think about these wholesale relationships as just that. They are relationships. And so when you start that relationship with trust and mutual understanding and that acknowledgement that buyers don't like to be interrupted during their workday, you're one step closer to having that partnership, rather than you just being against them as you try to get your product on their shelves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
A good question in the chat too here, and I can talk about category review dates in a second, but what about mailing them a sample instead of dropping by? Yeah, this can be dangerous too. I never suggest dropping off like blind shipping samples until you have made connection with that wholesale buyer. And here's why. Samples. So we used to get, I would probably get between 50 and 75 product samples a week when I was at Buy Right. Like it's a lot of samples. Like it can be like 10 brands a day, like knocking on your door. It's a lot of samples. And so what we would do is we would collect all those samples. We had something called the sample box. It was literally like an overflowing cardboard box that sat above my buyer desk. And whenever somebody shipped samples, blind ship samples, or whenever somebody just swung by with samples, they would hopefully make it to the sample box. Sometimes they didn't, right? Like think about it. If you make really fantastic, let's say you make CBD chocolates and you drop them off with that friendly cashier, that cashier, like as wonderful as they are, might decide they're going to go home with those delicious looking chocolates. Or they might decide, oh, we don't sell CBD, so the buyer doesn't need these chocolates. Like, I'm going to take them home, not knowing that buyer is like adding a CBD category 3 weeks from now. Or maybe the buyer's on vacation or maternity leave or whatever it is, the samples go missing. So ideally the samples go in the sample box. And then that buying team typically sits down. If they're like on it, they're sitting down like once a month, once a quarter to go through that sample box. And by the time they do, I mean, you can imagine, I saw your face, Kate, you're like, oh, the samples are crumpled or open. Like we would have people who would just like go and like sample from the sample box. The sell sheet is missing. The business cards are missing. Like in any case, they're certainly not how you intended your wonderful product to be perceived for the first time. So yeah, really good question about mailing samples. I highly, highly recommend that you make direct contact before you're just shipping or dropping off samples, because otherwise you're in that sample box and you have no idea if and when the buyer tries your product, which impacts your ability to successfully follow up with them. It's a very different conversation, very different sales conversation, depending on whether or not you know they've tried your product.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, that's like really the main reason why I was excited to have you on the call, and why I think that the work that you're doing is so important, is because you have that perspective of the buyer. And I think it's so important to have that, you know, kind of empathy for this person on the other side, and just blindly, you know, sending samples or dropping by, you know, it's not very respectful of their time. And, you know, you want to understand what their goals are too. Like you said, you know, what their goals are for their categories in their stores.
Totally. And Kate, I've got a couple other things to say around this topic. And the first one is, no one believes me, or brands have a really hard time believing me when I say this. But at the end of the day, when buyers are trying your samples, they're often evaluating your packaging more than they're evaluating your product itself, because taste is subjective, right? Like, just because I don't like your crackers does not mean my shoppers won't like your crackers. Or maybe I don't like your jalapeno jelly because I don't, this is not true, but because I don't like spicy things, or like whatever it is, doesn't mean that we don't need a jalapeno jelly for our shelves. Right? And so when we base our sales pitches off how delicious we are, how values aligned we are, how we're female founded or BIPOC founded, or supporting women, or, you know, whatever it is, right? And this is the shitty news, but like when we build our sales pitches off those subjective things, rather than how we're going to support the category goals, that buyer doesn't take us as seriously as when we're doing a sales pitch that's based off data.
Well, I mean,
does that make sense?
Yeah, it's the same with all marketing. I mean, when you're marketing to customers, you're not trying to tell them what you're good at. You're trying to tell them how you're going to solve their problem.
Right.
So
yes.
Same thing when you're convincing a buyer, you know, it's like, how am I going to solve your problem?
Absolutely. And the buyer's problem, the wholesale buyer's problem, is sales and margin of that category. And this can be really disheartening, right? As we're building brands that are values driven, or we're building these impactful brands, we're like, okay, Alli, so you're telling me that wholesale buyer doesn't actually care about that? Like, it can feel really disheartening. And there's always like a little disclaimer here. And I'd say, Kate, it really goes back to, again, making sure that you're partnering with the right retailers in the first place. That retailer, if that retailer is values aligned, yes, lead your sales pitch with the sales and margin data. And then we can add in a bullet point about the story or the values or the mission that you're supporting as well. And that's just like the icing on the cake. But first we need the sales and margin to come.
And it's not that those things aren't important, because
No.
I believe they're very important, but it's who you're talking to. It's like knowing your audience, and like you said, if that's the buyer's main goal, then you focus on their main goal first.
Yeah. Yeah. And so often we see brands, I think this is like a big switch that we see brands make once they join us in Retail Ready, is that typically they, like, before Retail Ready, they make buyer pitches, wholesale pitches that are based off story and taste. And those are wonderful things to talk to your end consumers about, right? Talk to that about people who are coming to your demos. Talk about that on your shelf talkers or your packaging. Like, those are wonderful places to talk about those things. And then after we go through our sales pitch process, you really start to craft your pitch that is all about the category goals. And like you said, Kate, supporting that buyer. And then that conversation can turn into taste and values down the line with the consumer.
Yeah, that makes sense. So then what about for like impact brands? I mean, once they get on the shelf, then what are some things they could do? If those are elements of their brand, what are some things they could do to help show those impacts? I mean, is it all in the packaging, or what else could they do?
Yeah, well, so first, I can't say this enough, that like getting in the right stores or right wholesale accounts for your product is step number one, right? You want to go to where your people are shopping, right? If you are a brand, if you're a social impact brand, you probably aren't attracting consumers at Walmart as much as attracting them at Whole Foods. We don't know, right? Like, there's arguments to be made in either places, and that's a little bit deeper strategy than we can talk about superficially on this call. But, in general, we want to go to the easiest place where our shoppers, or where our target is shopping, right? And then from there, Kate, you're right. It's a multi-pronged marketing approach. It is, are we talking about it on the packaging? Are we talking about it on a shelf talker? Are we connecting them back to our social media accounts where we're talking about it there? Are we getting their email addresses and emailing them once a month? Are we running geo-targeted ads that talk about our social mission, right? Kate, you're from marketing, so it's like, what are all those levers that we can pull to connect with the brand?
Yeah.
Or excuse me, to connect the brand with the shoppers.
Yeah, and like in-store sampling too, I think, is another one.
Demos, huge. I think an underappreciated way is also connecting with your store employees. And so I've got a lot of theories on demos and the return on investment there. They can be challenging in many ways, but one of the best things about demos is connecting with the store employees, having the opportunity to tell them about your product line, to get them really excited, to get them to taste your product line. And then long after you leave, you've got mini salespeople on the retail floor for you. And so often I think about they're like, it's great to do demos and talk to your consumers, but the most value is connecting with the store folks on the store level when you demo. Kimberly asks a really good question here. How do you gain insight into the specific retailer category goals? Yeah, this is a wonderful question, Kimberly. And this is going to sound overly simple, but you just ask them. You say, hey, so let's say I were the buyer. You could be like, hey, Alli, Kimberly, I'm sorry, I could scroll back up. I forget what your product line is. Bake Me Healthy. Okay, yes. Okay. Hey, Alli, I make a line of healthy baking mixes. We'd love to get on your shelves. On average, we sell 8 mixes a week at other independent stores. Is that aligned with what you're aiming for in your baking mix category? And they can say yes, or they can say no. They can be like, I actually 8, like, that's our slowest moving. You would be our slowest moving product. Like, actually, I don't think that's a great fit. And then we could counter argument with all the ways you're gonna make it not the slowest moving product. Or they might say, oh yeah, 8 units a week, like, awesome. Our other baking mixes were moving 4 units a week. Like, it's a yes from me. So you can just, it's as simple as asking them. And then when you do, again, it comes back to this, to showing that you are willing to be a partner, that you are willing to hear them and hear their goals and make a plan for how you're going to help achieve them.
Well, and I think that ties back to Gage asked the question earlier about category review date. It's like,
yes,
there are certain times when they're planning to review certain categories. So, considering that when you're approaching the buyer as well.
Totally. And so a category review, I'll give the one sentence on it, is when a buyer sits down and looks at the category as a whole and says, okay, I'm going to look at baking mixes, and we're going to look at the past quarter's sales or the past 6 months of sales or year, depending on how often they're doing that category review. They look at the top movers and they look at the slowest sellers. And typically that's when they discontinue the slow sellers and decide to bring in new products. Again, all as a way of betting. It's all like a gamble here of betting that if I discontinue this slow moving product that's selling 2 units a week and I bring in Kimberly's product, she just promised me she's going to move 8 units a week. Like, I just increase my sales by 6 units a week by placing a bet on Kimberly, right? So that's a category review. You can find category review schedules of a couple different ways. One, it's often on retailers' websites in like the footer. You got to go digging. Like, being in packaged products industry involves a lot of like good old internet sleuthing, but you can often find them on their websites. If you work with a broker or a distributor, they will have those, they should have those lists for you. Or you can find them in other community groups. Oftentimes, founders will share them with one another, and it's not a weird thing to ask. Oh, and then again, of course, you can ask the store outright. You can say, "I make baking mixes. When are you doing your baking category review?" I will say though, Kate, this is actually like pretty good news. We have retail ready brands who get in off cycle all the time. We actually just had someone who got slotted Whole Foods Global off Whole Foods Global category review cycle, which is just wild. And it all goes back to whether or not you have made a compelling enough reason, if you have a compelling enough reason for that buyer to bring you in off cycle, right? If that buyer thinks like, oh my goodness, like this woman is a 110% chance that she's going to help me fit my goals. Heck no, I'm not going to wait 6 more months to do this category review. Like, we're going to bring her in right now. So just because the category review isn't for another few months doesn't mean that you shouldn't move forward with pitching.
Mm-hmm. Now we've got another question. So tips for how to get the initial conversation with the buyer. So Angela is admitting here that she's definitely pulled samples off before, but she can't get in touch with anybody. So
do
if she's on the phone.
It's the worst. I will tell you, it is the worst, and it has only gotten harder through pandemic. You are not alone, Angela. Everyone complains about this. This is a really, really common complaint. First off, phone is the way to go. It is really easy to ignore an email, especially a mediocre sales email. It's really easy to just delete it. And so I always advise, like, call until you're going to hate this advice, but call until you are blue in the face. Call once a week for 6 months. And you want to keep calling until you get that like hard no, like, Angela, stop calling me. I am not interested in your product. It's a no, right? Until you hear those words, you keep on calling every week. We also use something. There's a couple different things, a couple resources for you guys. Mail Tracker is a really fantastic free Chrome extension. I don't know if they have it on other browsers. I use it on Chrome, but it integrates with Gmail or like whatever you're sending from. And the free version, which I love, I highly recommend the free version, has a little stamp at the bottom that lets the recipient know when lets the recipient know that you are alerted that they've read your email. And it's like a little green check, and it's like, Angela has now been alerted that you've opened her email. And it's amazing because it's just social pressure to get that buyer to write back to you, right? So I always love Mail Tracker. And the paid version gets rid of that stamp at the bottom, but we want the stamp because we want to put the pressure on the buyer. And it's really important to know, and this is a good question for you, Angela, it's really important to know whether or not those buyers are even opening your emails. Because if they're not opening your emails, then we need to address, are you going to spam, or do we need to work on your subject line so that we can start getting people to open your emails? Or if we're tracking it and they are opening your emails, but you're not getting any response back, then we work on the body of the email, right? So we've got to get a little bit more data about how far you're getting in that sales process before we know what to tweak. But yeah, phone first, Mail Tracker, start putting some pressure on, and then we can assess whether or not, how you tweak it once you know whether or not people are even opening your emails. One other resource that I had is called Clearbit Connect. Do you know that resource, Kate? Have you ever used it?
I don't think so. It doesn't sound familiar.
It's pretty cool. Again, it's an email puller where you can put in any website, and it'll give you a list of emails associated with that domain name. So, for things like, I'll just say, for things like Whole Foods and stuff that have, tens of thousands of email addresses with it, like it's not really going to work for you. But if you're looking to target independents or like smaller chains, say you put in, I'll just use Buy Right because that's my home. If you put in buyrite.com, it'll give you all the email associations with @buyrightmarket.com.
Yeah, write that down, guys, because
yeah.
this is like, I mean, we've definitely just guessed before too. Like, okay, I'm trying to get in touch with Allison Ball at Buy Right. So
yeah,
I'm gonna send an email to Allison@buyrite.com and see what happens. If it
totally
back, it's not the right one.
Totally, like a ball at Buy Right Market. Yeah, exactly. Allison B. Here, I'll put it right in the chat.
Awesome.
Yeah, Clearbit Connect. We really like that one. And again, free version is great. And then again, some like good old internet sleuthing. I mean, we had I don't know if Cult Crackers is part of brand Pollinators. If not, we should get them in there, but they're wonderful. A female-based brand here in Bay Area.
Okay.
They make gluten-free crackers that are incredible. They're in over 500 stores now, like real, and still, a great example of someone doing everything direct. They don't have a broker, they don't have a distributor, like they are going for it. But they had a lot of success. We developed a sales strategy in Instagram DMs, and it was kind of a roundabout way to do it, but found that like really was having a hard time, specifically during pandemic, like getting in touch with buyers who maybe were working from home or whatever it is. Developed a DM sales strategy, and they landed a couple of hundred accounts in the past few years, heavily leaning into DMs.
And that's Cult Crackers?
Yeah, CULT. Yep.
Crackers.
Cult Crackers. Yeah, they're really delicious. Let's see. I'm just scrolling up. One last part of this question. Any suggestions for networking of doing wholesale shows to get in front of buyers? Is it worth it or not really? That's a really good question. And I hate this answer, but again, it depends. It depends on you and your strategy, right? Like if you are looking to stay direct as long as you can and stay like, let's say you're in New England and you're trying to like stay regional, would I suggest that you go to Expo East out here Expo West out here in Anaheim, like next March? No, right? Because by the time you're at Expo West, you're likely using distribution. You likely are selling on the West Coast, things like that. Would I suggest, depending, doing regional shows? Sure. I love the Good Food Mercantile for younger, like values aligned brands. I think they're really fantastic. So it totally depends on you and your sales strategy. But once you're ready, yes, I like fancy food. I like expos, Good Food. I like Good Food Mercantile. I like Expo East, Expo West is my favorite. There are specialty shows, right? Like, New York and San Francisco Coffee Fest and things like that, just depending on your category. But
well, and if you're going to a big
depends.
show like Expo, I mean, is that something where you want to try to schedule meetings with the buyers ahead of time, or are you going and just kind of throwing business cards all over the place, hoping
Yeah, it's okay. So there's a couple different ways to do it. I actually have a past podcast episode that I should find for you, Kate, that's on trade show strategy here. But there's a couple different ways to do it. I always recommend, if you haven't been to the show ever, to go and walk the show first. Go as an attendee. You can still make connections. You can go to networking events, educational events, after parties.
Backpack brands now.
Yeah, exactly. Backpack brands. I think we're probably not allowed to say this on record because technically it's illegal to bring your product into shows if you're not exhibiting there. But so I always recommend either walking the show first or working someone else's booth. And you might even find like Brand Pollinators might be a great community to do this, where you can find someone else who is exhibiting at Fancy Food and needs an extra set of hands, right? You can get a free ticket to the show. You can work at somebody else's booth for a couple hours, get that interaction. So yeah. Oh yeah, it's Kimberly. Will anybody be at Expo East? Good question. So walking the show, working somebody else's booth, when you're finally ready to do it, yeah, there's a whole strategy there, right? Do you set up appointments ahead of time? Ideally, yes. Do you connect with retailers ahead of time via social media, LinkedIn, Instagram? Yes. Do you get your products in the press room? That's one of my sneaky things that I love to do, is get brands in the PR room, especially if you're something that's like a really great little like snack or beverage that they can sample as they're like chilling out off the trade show floor. A lot of like little tiny things that we can do to help impact your show success. Jay says, I didn't hear that walking the floor with our products are technically illegal. Yeah, they don't so typically you're not supposed to bring your own products onto the trade show floor. If you want to do it outside of the halls, go for it. But if it is an event where other brands are paying for space and you haven't paid for space, usually that's a no-go by the organizations. I see people do it all the time, but technically you're probably not supposed to do it. Angela, I'll find that podcast episode for you.
Yeah, and I'll share to your main podcast page.
Great. I also have something else that I want to put in the chat, and it's going back to that idea of like boosting sales in store. Kate, you were asking about shelf tuckers or packaging, or like, what do we do to actually sell through, especially as impact-driven brands? And again, one of the challenges that I see is that brands spend so much time and energy getting on the shelf that you've got very little resources left, whether that's, maybe just mental capacity to develop a marketing strategy to get off the shelf and into shoppers' baskets. So I always think about like, I always think about like a Venn diagram when we think about like, what are people doing here to drive sales? We want to think about goals. So here's our Venn diagram. And one of our circles is easy, labeled as easy, and the other circle is labeled as impactful. And we want to figure out what are those things that are at the intersection of easy and impactful. And we want to replicate them quarterly for our products. So that might be running a 20% off sale once a quarter. You do it once, you measure it, it was really easy for you to do, and you found it really drove velocity, right? That goes right in the middle, and we're going to replicate it quarterly. Or maybe you love doing a staff training once a quarter. Easy, impactful, we replicate it quarterly, right? And so, Kate, I always think about like, what is that thing what is the simplest plan that we can actually execute consistently to drive sales on the shelf? So I have something, it's called the reorder checklist. We have like a full version of this built out in Retail Ready, but this is like the Cliff's Notes version to get you started. You can take it, customize it for your own brand. And it's just a little cheat sheet of some of the things that you can put in place with each new wholesale account to start driving those reorders.
Very cool. Yeah, that's so important. Because I mean, like you said in the beginning, like your brand, your product might just get dropped off during a category review,
Yep.
or if it's becoming really apparent that it's just not selling once you do get on shelves.
Yeah.
So yeah, really paying attention to what you can do.
And, I always think, again, it goes back to partnerships. And when we would do category reviews, if we had two brands who were kind of at the bottom there, and one brand was a brand that maybe had like flaky founder who didn't always ship their orders on time, or always forgot to email an invoice, or was kind of rude when they dropped off their deliveries. And then there's another founder who's lovely and delightful and demoing once a quarter and shipping samples for our staff to try, or right. I'm going to keep the brand who's actually trying rather than the cranky person who isn't supporting their product on shelf. So I mean, it's just business 101. We want to do business with good people. So if you can show up as that wonderful supporter of your brand, that goes a long way in those retail relationships.
I think we had one other question that we didn't get to. Kimberly had asked about, she said, I know there isn't a cookie cutter approach to channel strategy, but are there general tips for that evolution of D2C, e-retailer, grocer? How does that?
Yep. So typically we see a multi-pronged approach here, where businesses, and again, this is just typical, but businesses do some e-commerce and some brick and mortar wholesale. And after you dip your toes in both, it's really important to measure your profitability in those channels and make sure that you're making money, right? Because we might say okay, you might think that a brick and mortar is the place for your brand, but you are there for 6 months and your sales are really slow. They only sell when you put yourself on sale, or when you're paying for demos, or whatever it is. And you might find that you're making pennies on the dollar, and that's not a sustainable, profitable sales channel for you. Controversially, you might be oh, I do farmers markets and direct-to-consumer subscription boxes, and I make much more margin there. I have more fun doing it. I can make a good enough living to support me and my family. I'm going to go that route. So it really depends. But Kimberly, I would say typically what we see is people do both at the same time, e-commerce and wholesale, and start regionally before you really start shipping your product all over the country, because it's really hard to support your product on shelves that are a plane ride away.
Yeah, Martha asked, is there a scenario where even if you're not making much money on D2C, it's still worthwhile for the marketing?
Totally. It can be a marketing play for you. Absolutely. There is something that's so powerful about user generated content, right? So and social validation. So if you find that you have a really engaging audience of consumers, direct to consumer, who take pictures of your product, who share your story, share their experience on socials, who are praising you from the rooftops, that can be a super strong marketing lever to pull. But if you're losing money on it month over month, if it's stressful for you, if you don't have the bandwidth to do it, if you don't have I always think about bandwidth and desire. We need both, and skills, right? We need all three. Or if you're willing to learn the skills or hire someone who has the skills. But at the end of the day, we can't stay in business unless we're profitable.
I've
So we
seen,
have to find the profitable channels.
I've seen a lot of brands lately who are doing like free samples from their website, and you just, you just pay shipping kind of thing. And I'm curious about what your thoughts are on that, because I think it's definitely not profitable, but Gage just mentioned one of the best ways to learn about your customers.
Totally. Right. And it's again, it like goes back to strategy here. Like I actually know a retail ready brand who's doing this right now. Free samples on her website. She's beverage brand, but shelf stable beverage brand in cans. And she's doing free samples if you pay for shipping. And what's really interesting for us to start to analyze is if she's just attracting the freebie seekers, or if she's actually attracting people who are interested in her brand. And so I feel like you've got to figure out, like, you have to have a way of figuring out like who's attracted to your brand in the first place. So that might be like post-consumer surveys. It might be, again, like running retargeting ads to see if you can't get that repeat purchaser from the people who just paid for shipping and got samples, who's following you back on your socials and actually engaging with your posts. There's just so much that we can learn about our audience from direct to consumer sales, which actually would then impact where it would impact your channel strategy, right? Because if you're like, oh, actually, like my people are shopping at Walmart, like I'm gonna put all my eggs in that basket. That would be really important to know before you're 3 years in and have designed your entire strategy around Whole Foods.
Well, and something we do, you do, and I do in the service, side of things is to, just be able to collect those email addresses too, so that we can kind of build that funnel of like providing more information or, giving out discounts or something in the future. And then that sort of builds, the likelihood that people would follow later on.
Yeah. And it's really interesting to track the sales cycle too, right? Like, you might have people who are following you for months and months and months,
right,
and don't make a purchase until Black Friday, or they don't make a purchase until 4th of July, because I don't know, red, white, and blue sprinkles are exactly what they were looking for at the end of June. I don't know, right? So it is really interesting to see about like when you connect with your consumer and where they purchase you in that lifetime. So much data. And the last thing I'll say here is really recognizing that as a young brand, too much data can also be overwhelming and more than you need. So we really think about, at least on the wholesale side of things, getting really clear on what's your conversion rate when you pitch to new accounts, right? So how many accounts do I have to pitch to in order to get on shelf? What's my average velocity on those shelves, so we can start making sales projections? And
the velocity is how quickly the product is moving, how many units per week or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. And what's the margin? When I do my sales, if I'm working with brokers and distributors and paying out margin here and there, like at the end of the day, what is my profit margin here, and is it worth it? And once we know those numbers, we can really think, we can start making business projections about like, how much do I actually have to sell in order to pay myself a salary? How much do I need to sell in order to make this a viable business?
Well, it's 11 o'clock now, so I don't want to go too far over time. But I know we could continue talking about this forever because it's such an interesting conversation, and I think there's so much value here. But Alli has so many more resources for you on that the podcast. Definitely check out. I sent the link there, but you can listen to it anywhere, and she's giving away so much great information on her podcast every single week. She's running the Retail Ready program, so if you're looking to kind of build your retail strategy, definitely cool. It's, what is it, like 12 weeks? How long is the program?
Oh, so Retail Ready, actually it's wild. It's once you enroll, you get lifetime access to it. But it is 15 modules that you work through. So if you did a module a week, it would take you about a quarter, about 3 months to get through. And then I'll just drop my Instagram in the chat because that's really where I hang out the most. If you send me a DM, I can shoot you some more resources or like tell me where you need support and I can direct you to a specific podcast episode. And I'll follow you back. I mean, it's really fun for me to meet new brands and see what folks are working on.
That's awesome. Very cool. Well, thanks
Yeah.
so much for being here today. Thank you all for being here. And definitely keep in touch. I'm going to send our link for the Brand Pollinators email so you can sign up and make sure you find out about more events like this that are coming up. Definitely shoot me an email at any time or follow, connect with me on LinkedIn. If you have any other questions or requests for topics that we should cover, we just really do want to help you succeed. And so, we're doing our best to provide resources that are available. One other thing I just wanted to quickly mention is that we're starting a program with Brand Pollinators where we're connecting founders to each other to have individual one-on-one conversations to help get some insights about things that they might want to try. So the goal is to match you with 2 people each month. So one would be somebody who knows about something that you want to know about, like maybe they've done the Retail Ready program and you want to hear what it's like, and then the other one would be somebody who wants to learn something from you. So maybe you've redesigned your packaging or you've gotten some kind of certification and you're willing to kind of share how that process went. So anyway, we're setting that up. If you're interested, I've run a couple rounds of the pilot program and people have loved it so far. So please shoot me an email if you want to check it out. It's Kate at Brand Pollinators, and we'd love to have you and connect you with more people.
That sounds like a great resource. I love that, Kate.
I'm excited about it.
Super smart. Yeah.
It's been really fun. Well, thank you again for being here. It's been so fun, and hopefully we'll be able to have you on again soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Nice to meet you guys.
Natalie.
Have a good one.